Welcome to another journey when we consider the impact of the Hebrew preachers on the thought and the life of Jesus. Last Sunday we talked about Amos, and the blame game is over, and then how he taught about the transgressions of the Israelites having to do with their treatment of the poor and their attitude towards the poor. Well, that was Amos in the 8th century BC. So there's 800 years, and Jesus came on the scene. And Jesus, in his reading and understanding the history of his people, saw how the commitment of the establishment to have a king, to have a nation, to have a temple had gone wrong. It just hadn't worked. But Jesus also saw how the commitment of those who followed Deuteronomy 6:4, the commandment, had brought, was so powerful and so life-changing. So over 800 years of history, Jesus knew that history well, and he saw how the establishment had gone wrong, and people who followed the law of Deuteronomy, their lives were powerful and lives were changed. So as Jesus taught the truth of Hosea that we considered first, now how he teaches the truth of Amos. And we will consider both the fact that Amos, how he put together the message was that the blame game is over, and then his message had to do with the transgressions against the poor. We'll deal with both of these. But first of all, the blame game is over. There's so many references we could choose to look at in Jesus' teaching concerning how we must accept responsibility for our own behavior and the consequences of our own actions. But I think it's enough to turn to Matthew 7 and see what Jesus said about the whole syndrome of blaming others. Because Jesus said, "Do not judge, lest you be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you." Why do you see the speck that is in another's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to the other, "Let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is still in your own eye"? You hypocrites, first take the log out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to take the speck out of the other's eye. Now that's pretty clear. But what's fascinating to me about this teaching of Jesus is that he understood the blame game as described by Amos. But that's sort of like going to a doctor and discovering you have a headache without determining the cause. And in Matthew, in Jesus' teaching, Jesus was getting at the cause of the blame game. And the cause of the blame game, corporately in a nation or individually as the faithful, the cause of the blame game, according to Jesus, was the attitude of judgment. Look at it briefly in terms of corporately in the nation of Israel. Indeed, one of their values of the establishment was to have a nation. And what was their attitude in that nation? We're good and you're bad. You're bad and we're good. They want to have kings. What's the attitude of kingship? I reign, and you are the subject of my reign. Judging another to be the subject of one's authority. And the temple. They had the temple. They had the Holy of Holies. They had the place for God. And indeed, with the attitude of judgment to others, we have God and you don't. And so you see, what Jesus did was take the message of Amos, the blame game, and looked at the cause of that had to do with the attitude of judgment. And Jesus couldn't get the attitude of judgment aligned with Deuteronomy 6:4. He said those two don't fit together. And so Jesus explored that and discovered that the attitude of judgment is a core problem for all of us to wrestle with in our journey of faith. And remember how Jesus taught and he also lived. Remember on the cross, Jesus didn't rant and rage. He didn't condemn. Rather, he committed the care of his mother to one of his disciples. Indeed, he said to his companions on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Jesus not only taught against judging others, but in his own life he refused to judge others. Even on the cross, or the woman at the well, or any other opportunity, he realized that one has the choice between the attitude of judgment and the attitude of love. You see, these two are entirely different. Because when one has the attitude of judgment, it is sort of like this. As I approach the other in an attitude of judgment, I say, Maddie, you're wrong. And these are the reasons why you're wrong. And I'm right. And let me tell you why I'm right. That's the attitude of judgment. We approach the other immediately from the perspective of judging. And Jesus said, "Why are you doing that, Bruce? You've got a log in your own eye trying to see the speck in the other." But the opposite of that is the attitude of love. And Jesus brought such a fresh new approach to how we are to relate to others as persons of faith. For indeed, as we relate to others, Jesus called upon us to be witnesses. And the attitude of love through witnessing is rather than saying, "Maddie, you're wrong, and I'm right." The attitude of love in witnessing is to say, "Maddie, this is what I think, this is what I believe, this is what I feel. You're different, and you may have different beliefs and different thoughts and different feelings." Do you see the difference between the attitude of judgment and the attitude of love through witnessing and sharing with each other? Indeed, Jesus was all about the heart of the blame game. And the heart of the blame game is the attitude of judgment, the lifestyle of the established. And he replaced it with the attitude of love, the lifestyle of witnessing. And that leads us to look at the second thing that Jesus did with Amos' message, and that had to do with the teaching of Amos concerning the poor. Now, let's just take the broad stroke of Jesus' life and realize, as biblical scholars have pointed out so many times, Jesus had a preference for the poor. We can look at the story of Lazarus in Luke. He was poor. The other was rich. And Jesus had a preference for the poor as he told that story. Indeed, the story of the rich young man, the story of what Jesus did in the temple as he tossed out the money changers, wealthy making money off the poor. Indeed, the guests at the wedding feast, when the established wealthy wouldn't come, go out the highways and byways and invite those in. And I think the best understanding of how Jesus had a preference for the poor is a word that is used in the scriptures describing the story of Jesus as the multitudes followed him. Well, when you look at that Greek word, there's another meaning of that word, because the multitudes sort of conjure up an idea of all these people, the numbers. But when you look at that word, it can be translated the marginalized, the outcasts, the have-nots. Those are for whom Jesus had a preference. And you see, Jesus' followers were not the establishment. They were the marginalized. Look at Palm Sunday. Do you think the establishment were the people waving palms and putting palms on the streets so the ass that Jesus was riding would have something to walk on? No, they were the marginalized. They were the poor. They were the outcasts. They were the have-nots. They were those who followed Jesus because they knew Jesus had a preference for the poor. Indeed, his passion was not to reign with luxury with the establishment, of which he could have done, but rather it was to serve all with a preference for the poor in service. So Jesus' own life and his teachings had to do with lifting up that truth that Amos talked about, in that the transgressions of Israel that were present in Amos' time, of the oppression of the poor, the social injustice, the economic injustice, the living in luxury, indeed, through ups and downs, continued to Jesus' day. And Jesus, in his life and in his ministry, had a preference for the poor. So again, we see in an 8th century prophet, BC prophet, how Jesus unpacked that message of Amos, said it in a way that would be relevant to the people of his day and the people of every day, including you and including me. We're called by Jesus to have an attitude of love through witnessing, rather than an attitude of judgment towards others. And when there is a choice, we must always choose as a preference for the poor. Now, that's enough for Blake to share, so let me raise some questions for you to think about. And I guess the first would be, as you remember your own journey of faith, was it one that you were introduced to the faith as a faith expressing judgment, or faith expressing love? Was your introduction to the faith to have an attitude of judgment or to have an attitude of love through witnessing? Another question: why is it so cotton-picking easy to judge and have the attitude of judgment, and so demanding and difficult to have the attitude of love in witnessing? Why is it so hard? But thirdly, I would raise the question: how can the church today avoid the trappings of the temple and rather experience our life together and church buildings as a meeting place for the faithful who love? How can we avoid the trappings of the temple today? And finally, what is the difference between having a preference for the poor over against accepting and welcoming the poor? What's the difference between having a preference for the poor and accepting and welcoming the poor? Enjoy the journey of thought, and we'll talk about this Sunday.